Chapter 1. The Legend of the Eagle. Our story begins not with an empire, but with a people without a land. They were the Mexica, a nomadic, Nahuatl-speaking tribe on the fringes of the great civilizations of the Valley of Mexico. In the 13th century, this valley was a vibrant and crowded place, dominated by powerful city-states. The Mexica were the latecomers, the outsiders, often despised as poor, uncultured barbarians. They were a people in search of a home, but their journey was not a random migration. It was a sacred quest, a divine command from their fierce and demanding patron god, a deity of war and the sun, whose name was Huitzilopochtli. Unlike the established gods of the great cities, Huitzilopochtli was a young and hungry god. The legends told that he had been born fully grown and armed, leaping from his mother's womb to slay his hundreds of jealous siblings. He was the sun at its midday peak, a relentless warrior, and he was the driving force behind his chosen people. His priests would carry a sacred bundle containing his idol, and through dreams and visions, Huitzilopochtli would guide their path, promising them a glorious destiny, a promised land that he alone would show them. Their story, as they told it, began in a mythical homeland far to the north called Aztlan, the place of whiteness, or the place of the herons. It was an island in a lake, a paradise of abundance, but it was not their home to keep. Huitzilopochtli commanded them to leave Aztlan and begin a great wandering, a sacred journey known as the peregrination. They were to walk, generation after generation, until he gave them a sign, a prophesied vision that would mark the center of their new world. And so, they left paradise and began their long walk into the unknown. For 200 years, the Mexica wandered. Their journey was one of immense hardship. They were driven from place to place by more powerful, established tribes who feared their fierce ways and their demanding god. They would settle for a time, building a small village and planting crops, only to be forced out by war or a divine command from Huitzilopochtli to continue their journey. They lived in harsh lands, in caves, and on barren hillsides. Their faith in their god, their only constant companion. This long ordeal forged them into a hardy, disciplined, and utterly ruthless people, bound by a fanatical devotion to their god. The most infamous and defining moment of their journey came when they were granted a temporary home near the powerful city of Colhuacan. The king of Colhuacan, seeing the strength of the Mexica warriors, sought an alliance. He offered his own daughter as a bride for the Mexica leader, with the intention that she would be deified and worshipped as a goddess among them. The Mexica accepted the offer. The princess was brought to their camp, but Huitzilopochtli had a different, more terrible plan. To the Mexica, the greatest honor that could be bestowed upon a mortal was to be sacrificed to the gods, their life force feeding the divine. In a secret ritual, they sacrificed the princess of Colhuacan. A short time later, the king was invited to the ceremony to honor his deified daughter. He entered the dark temple, burning incense as an offering, and in the flickering torchlight, he saw a priest dancing in the ritual, wearing the freshly flayed skin of his beloved daughter as a sacred garment. The king's shriek of horror and rage echoed through the temple. He called his warriors, and a vicious battle ensued. The Mexica, hopelessly outnumbered, were driven from the land, hunted and pursued until they had nowhere left to run. They were forced to flee into the last and least desirable place in the entire valley, the vast, swampy shallows of Lake Texcoco. Hiding among the reeds and the snakes, they were now exiles in the truest sense, a people with no land, no allies, and a fearsome reputation. It seemed their journey had ended in a final, humiliating failure. But it was here, at their lowest point, surrounded by mud and murky water, that they finally saw it. The sign their God had promised them for centuries. The prophecy that had driven their ancestors from their mythical home. There, on a small, swampy island among the reeds, was a great nopal cactus, its spiny pads laden with red fruit. And perched atop this cactus was a magnificent golden eagle, its wings spread wide against the sun. In its powerful talons, it held a writhing rattlesnake, which it was in the process of devouring. To the Mexica priests, the meaning was immediate and profound. It was a vision of cosmic destiny. The eagle was a symbol of the sun and the heavens, their god Huitzilopochtli himself. The snake was a symbol of the earth and the underworld. Here, on this unassuming patch of mud, was the place where heaven and earth met, the axis of the universe. This was the sign. Their 200-year journey was over. A great joy and relief must have washed over the exhausted tribe. They had been led through the wilderness, tested, scorned, and exiled. But their God had not abandoned them. He had led them to their promised land. It was not a fertile valley or a great established city, but a small, muddy island. But it was theirs. And so, in the year 1325, on that unlikely spot, the Mexica began the most ambitious engineering project in the history of the Americas. They began to build their city. They drove stakes into the soft lake bed. They built artificial islands, and they laid the foundations for a great temple at the very spot where the eagle had consumed the serpent. They called their new home Tenochtitlan, the place of the fruit of the nopal cactus. It was a humble, waterlogged beginning for what would, in less than 2 centuries, become one of the largest, most powerful, and most magnificent cities on the face of the earth. Chapter 2. Venice of the New World. The prophecy was fulfilled. The eagle had consumed the serpent. But the promised land was not a paradise of rolling hills and fertile plains. It was a swampy, marshy island in the middle of a vast, saline lake. To any other people, it would have been a place of exile, a last resort. To the Mexica, guided by their relentless God, it was a blank canvas, an opportunity to build a world in their own image. The challenge before them was immense. How do you build a great city, a new world capital, on what was little more than a muddy bog? Their solution would become one of the greatest feats of engineering and agriculture in human history. They began not by building up, but by building out. They created land where there was none. This was the ingenious system of the Chinampas. They were not truly floating gardens, as they are sometimes called, but artificial, rectangular islands, painstakingly constructed from the materials of the lake itself. First, the builders would drive long wooden stakes into the soft lake bed, creating a rectangular enclosure. Within this frame, they would weave a dense mat of reeds and branches, creating a sturdy foundation. Then, for months, they would dredge the nutrient-rich mud and decaying vegetation from the bottom of the lake and pile it onto this mat until it rose above the water's surface. To anchor these new islands of earth permanently, they would plant fast-growing willow trees along the edges, whose dense root systems would grip the lake bed and bind the Chinampa in place. The result was a masterpiece of sustainable agriculture, a network of fertile rectangular islands separated by canals that acted as both irrigation channels and the city's first streets. The nutrient-rich mud made the soil incredibly productive, and the constant supply of water from the canals meant the crops never went thirsty. On these Chinampas, the Aztecs could grow up to 7 harvests a year, an astonishing output that produced a massive surplus of maize, beans, squash, tomatoes, and chili peppers. It was this agricultural marvel, this conquest of the lake itself, that would feed the city and fuel the growth of their empire. With the problem of food and land solved, the city of Tenochtitlan began to take its magnificent shape. It was a city born of a meticulous plan, a grid of human ingenuity laid over the chaos of nature. The city was divided into 4 great quadrants, or campagnes, each with its own neighborhoods, temples, and markets. These quadrants met at the very heart of the city, the great sacred precinct, the axis of their universe. The streets of this city were not of cobblestone, but of water. A vast network of canals crisscrossed the metropolis, and daily life was conducted by canoe. Thousands upon thousands of canoes plied these waterways, carrying everything from building materials and tribute goods to farmers taking their produce to market. To connect their island capital to the mainland shores, the Aztecs built 3 magnificent causeways, wide, straight roads of stone and earth that rose from the water. These causeways were marvels of engineering, sometimes stretching for 5 miles. But they were also designed for defense. At intervals, the stone was replaced by wooden bridges that could be quickly removed in times of war, turning the city into an impenetrable island fortress. And to solve the problem of fresh water, as the lake itself was brackish, they built 2 great stone aqueducts that brought clean, fresh water from the springs at Chapultepec on the mainland, directly into the heart of the city, where it was distributed to public fountains and reservoirs. At the very center of this bustling, water-bound world, where the 4 quadrants met, stood the great sacred precinct. It was a massive, walled square, a city within a city, the spiritual and political heart of the empire. Inside its walls were palaces, schools for priests, and dozens of temples to the various gods. But one structure dominated all others, a man-made mountain that rose toward the heavens, the Templo Mayor, the great temple of Tenochtitlan. It was a colossal stepped pyramid, but with a unique design. At its summit stood not one, but two twin temples reached by a great double staircase. Each temple was dedicated to one of the two most important forces in the Aztec world. One temple, painted a brilliant white and blue, was dedicated to Tlaloc, the ancient god of rain, water, and fertility. The other, painted a stark and terrifying red and white, was dedicated to their patron, the young and fierce Huitzilopochtli, the god of the sun and of war. This twin temple design was a constant architectural reminder of the core of their worldview, the sacred pact known as water and blood, the two substances necessary to nourish the gods and ensure the survival of the cosmos. Within this sacred precinct were other, more terrifying structures. There was the temple of the feathered serpent god, Quetzalcoatl, and a court for the sacred ball game. And there was the Tzompantli, a giant skull rack, a horrifying wooden palisade upon which the skulls of thousands of sacrificial victims were displayed, a grim and public testament to the debts the Aztecs believed they owed their hungry gods. If the sacred precinct was the spiritual heart of the empire, its economic heart beat in the neighboring island city of Tlatelolco. Here was the great market, an institution so vast, so orderly, and so vibrant that the Spanish conquistadors who first witnessed it were left speechless, convinced they were dreaming. The Spanish chronicler Bernal Diaz del Castillo wrote that they had never seen a market so large, so well regulated, and so full of people in all the world. Tens of thousands of people gathered here daily. It was not a chaotic bazaar, but a highly organized city of commerce. There were streets assigned for each specific good. There was a street for the jewelers, selling exquisite ornaments of gold, silver, jade, and turquoise. There was a street for the feather workers, who wove the brilliant plumes of tropical birds into breathtaking mosaics and headdresses. There were sections for pottery, for sandals, for animal skins, and for slaves. The food section was a world unto itself, with every kind of vegetable, fruit, fish, and game imaginable, from turkeys and dogs to spirulina, algae skimmed from the surface of the lake. A special court of judges sat at the edge of the market, instantly settling any disputes over prices or goods, ensuring that the strict rules of commerce were upheld. Here, goods were not bought with coins, but bartered, with cacao beans and quills filled with gold dust, acting as a form of currency. This was Tenochtitlan, an impossible city, born from a prophecy, built on a swamp. It was a masterpiece of human will and engineering, a perfectly ordered, thriving metropolis, that was both beautiful and terrifying. It was the powerful, beating heart of an empire, a testament to the grand and terrible vision that began with an eagle, a serpent, and a humble cactus. Chapter 3. The Floating Gardens. In the story of the Aztec people, the Mexica, we have followed them on their 200-year journey to a destined yet inhospitable home. They were a people of the earth, yet their God had led them to a place with almost no earth to stand upon, a vast, shallow, and swampy lake high in the mountains of central Mexico. To survive, they could not simply settle upon the land. They had to create it. What they accomplished next was not just a feat of farming, but a reenactment of their own creation myth. Just as the first primordial land had risen from the cosmic waters at the dawn of time, the Mexica would now raise their own world from the mud of Lake Texcoco. This is the story of the Chinampas, the so-called floating gardens. The term floating garden is a poetic misnomer. These were not rafts of earth drifting upon the water. They were something far more ingenious and permanent. Artificial, man-made islands, meticulously engineered to be the most productive farmland on the planet. The process was a slow, patient, and deeply intelligent collaboration with the natural world. It began with a survey of the shallow lake. The Mexica would pole their canoes through the marshy waters, seeking out the perfect locations. Then, the work of building a foundation would commence. Using long, sharpened stakes of the water-resistant ahuejote tree, what we would call a willow, they would drive these posts deep into the soft lake bed, marking out a long rectangular enclosure, typically about 100 feet long and 20 feet wide. These stakes formed the skeletal frame of the new land. Next, within this enclosure, the builders would weave an intricate web of reeds, sticks, and branches, creating a giant, submerged basket. This woven wall, the China Mittel, was the container that would hold the new earth. With the frame in place, the most laborious part of the process began. From canoes, workers would dredge the rich, dark, nutrient-laden mud and decaying vegetation from the bottom of the lake. They would scoop up this precious silt and pile it, layer after layer, into the reed enclosure. They alternated these layers of mud with layers of aquatic plants and decaying grasses from the marsh, creating a kind of divine compost heap. Slowly, painstakingly, the new island would rise from the water's surface. A long rectangular patch of the richest, blackest earth imaginable, surrounded on all sides by the life-giving water of the lake. But the final and most crucial step was to make it permanent. The builders would plant the fast-growing ahuejote willow trees at the corners and along the sides of the new island. Over the years, the roots of these trees would grow down deep into the lake bed, acting as powerful, living anchors that would bind the Chinampa in place, preventing the precious soil from ever washing away. The result was a perfect, self-sustaining, agricultural marvel. The canals that separated the Chinampas were the key to their incredible productivity. The porous, absorbent soil of the islands would constantly wick water up from the canals through capillary action, meaning the crops were perpetually and perfectly irrigated. There was never a drought on a chinampa. Furthermore, the Aztecs would periodically dredge the canals, piling the new, nutrient-rich mud and decayed organic matter from the bottom onto the garden beds, constantly refertilizing the soil. This system was so efficient that it was almost magical. While a farmer on the mainland might be lucky to get 1 or 2 harvests a year, the Chinampas could produce up to 7. It was a year-round, non-stop engine of agriculture. To achieve this, the Aztecs used special seed beds called almachigos. On these smaller dedicated plots, they would sprout their maize, beans, and squash. Once the seedlings were strong enough, they would be carefully transplanted to the main chinampa. This meant that no part of the garden was ever left fallow. A new crop was always ready to be planted the moment the previous one was harvested, and the variety of what they grew was immense. The great staples of Mesoamerica, maize, beans, and squash, formed the core of their production. But the Chinampas were also covered with tomatoes, chili peppers, and the nutritious grain of amaranth. And, crucially, they dedicated vast portions of their Chinampas to the cultivation of flowers. The Xochitl. Flowers were an essential part of Aztec life, used in every religious ceremony and as offerings to the gods. The Chinampas turned the lake into a vibrant, colorful tapestry of food and flowers. This network of artificial islands became a unique aquatic neighborhood. The canals were the streets. The primary mode of transport was the chalupa, a small, flat-bottomed canoe. Every morning, you would see the farmers tending to their crops and then loading their canoes high with fresh produce. A great flotilla of these canoes would then set out from the Chinampa districts each day, paddling through the canal streets towards the great market at Tlatelolco, carrying the food that would sustain the massive, thriving heart of the empire. Many of the farmers built their own simple houses of reeds and mud directly on their Chinampas, living their entire lives in this strange and beautiful water world. This agricultural system was the economic engine that made Tenochtitlan possible. It allowed the Aztecs to support a population of over 200,000 people on a site that should have been uninhabitable. It was a masterpiece of sustainable engineering, a system that worked in perfect harmony with its environment, turning a liability, a swampy, shallow lake, into the empire's greatest asset. The Chinampas were more than just farms. They were a physical expression of the Aztec worldview. They were a testament to their ability to create order from chaos, to build a world in their own image, and to make the very earth itself bloom through a combination of hard labor, deep patience, and profound ingenuity. They were a quiet, green, and living monument to the spirit of a people who, having been promised a home by their God, chose to build it themselves, piece by piece, from the mud of the lake. Chapter 4. The Great Market. In the story of any great civilization, There is a place that represents the beating heart of its power. A place where all the arteries of trade and culture converge. For the Aztec Empire, this heart was not the emperor's palace, nor even the great temple, but the vast, sprawling, and breathtakingly organized market held in the sister city of Tlatelolco. When the first Spanish conquistadors laid eyes upon it, they were so stunned by its scale and sophistication that they questioned if they were dreaming. The soldier Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who walked its streets, would later write in his old age, "Some of our soldiers, who had been in many parts of the world, in Constantinople, and all over Italy, and in Rome, said that so large a marketplace, and so full of people, and so well regulated and arranged, they had never beheld before." To understand the market, we must first imagine the morning commute. As the sun rose over the great volcanoes, the canals of Tenochtitlan would come alive. A great flotilla of thousands of slender canoes, or chalupas, would begin to move through the city's water streets. From the south came the farmers of the Chinampas, their canoes piled high with a green and vibrant bounty of vegetables, maize, and bright flowers. From the mainland shores came merchants, their larger canoes laden with heavy goods like timber, stone, and pottery. And from the distant provinces of the empire came the honored Pochteca, the long-distance traders, their canoes filled with the exotic luxuries of the lowlands, brilliant green quetzal feathers, jaguar pelts, and precious cacao beans. All were heading to the same destination. Arriving at Tlatelolco was to arrive in a city of commerce. The market itself was an immense paved square, so large that the Spanish claimed it could hold over 60,000 people. But this was not a chaotic bazaar. It was a masterpiece of order, a testament to the Aztec genius for organization. The entire market was laid out in a grid of streets, and each street was dedicated to a single type of good. This meticulous arrangement meant that there was no confusion, no need to hunt for what you were looking for. Let us walk through its imaginary streets. In one section, we find the jewelers, their stalls glittering with the finest craftsmanship in the empire. Here are necklaces of jade, a stone more precious than gold to the Aztecs. Here are earplugs of polished obsidian and intricate ornaments of beaten gold and silver. A few streets over, we find the feather workers, the Amantecas, masters of a uniquely Mesoamerican art form. We see them weaving the iridescent green feathers of the quetzal and the shimmering blue feathers of the hummingbird into magnificent cloaks, fans, and the great warrior headdresses worn by the nobility. We walk further, and our senses are overwhelmed by the food section. Here are mountains of maize, the staple of all life, in colors we would find strange, blue, red, and black, alongside the familiar yellow and white. There are pyramids of avocados, tomatoes, and countless varieties of beans and squash. There are vendors selling ropes of dried chili peppers, their pungent aroma filling the air. In another section, there are cages filled with live turkeys and pens of small, hairless dogs, both of which were a primary source of meat. There are stalls selling fresh fish from the lake, and others selling strange delicacies like spirulina algae, which was skimmed from the water and formed into nutritious green cakes. And everywhere, there are vendors selling ready-to-eat food, hot, steaming tamales wrapped in corn husks, fresh tortillas cooked on a clay griddle, and mugs of a warm, thick corn-based drink called atole. The market was a complete department store for the Aztec world. There was a street for medicinal herbs, where you could find remedies for any ailment. There was a street for pottery of every shape and size, a street for baskets, a street for sandals made from the fiber of the magiigi plant, and a street for the fearsome obsidian blades and the wooden clubs of the maquahuitl. But how was all of this trade conducted? The Aztecs did not have coins. Most trade was simple barter, but for smaller, standardized transactions, they used a universally accepted form of currency, the cacao bean, the source of chocolate. A single large tomato might cost you 1 bean. A canoe full of fresh water might cost 3. A great turkey could be purchased for 100 beans. For larger transactions, standardized lengths of cotton cloth, called quachtli, were used. This great market was more than just a place to buy and sell. It was the social hub of the empire. It was where news and gossip were exchanged. It was where people from every walk of life and every corner of the vast empire would meet and mingle. In a single glance, you could see a powerful noble adorned in jade and feathers, a fierce jaguar warrior in his animal pelt regalia, a humble farmer from the Chinampas, and a wealthy Pochteca merchant, instantly recognizable by his distinct hairstyle and the long staff he carried. And in one corner of the market, there was a darker section, the slave market. Here, men and women who had been captured in war, who had been condemned for a crime, or who had even sold themselves or their children into servitude to pay off a debt, were bought and sold. It was a grim reminder that, for all its order and splendor, the Aztec world was built on a rigid and often brutal social hierarchy. The great market of Tlatelolco was the vibrant, beating heart of a powerful and sophisticated empire. It was a testament to their genius for organization, a symbol of the immense wealth that flowed into their capital from every corner of their domain. It stood in stark contrast to the solemn, bloody rituals of the nearby Templo Mayor, but it was inextricably linked to it. The market was where the immense wealth of the empire was created and displayed, and the temple was where the Aztecs believed the great spiritual debts for that prosperity had to be paid. To the Spanish who saw it, it was a wonder that surpassed anything they had known in the Old World. A final, breathtaking glimpse of a complex civilization at its absolute peak. Chapter 5. The Mandatory Schools. In the heart of the bustling city of Tenochtitlan, amidst the grandeur of the temples and the chaos of the market, There existed an institution that was, in many ways, the most revolutionary of all. It was a system of universal, mandatory education for every single child in the empire, regardless of their social class or their gender. At a time when literacy and formal education in Europe were the exclusive privilege of the wealthy elite and the clergy, the Aztecs believed that every citizen had a right and a duty to be educated. This system was the furnace where the Aztec mind was forged, and it was designed to create a specific kind of person, a disciplined, productive, and devout citizen who understood their precise place in the great machinery of the empire. The Aztec educational system was divided into two distinct paths, two different kinds of schools for two different kinds of life. The choice of which school a child attended was largely based on their social standing, but it was not an unbreakable rule. For the vast majority, the children of commoners, farmers, and craftsmen, their destination was the Telpochcali, the House of Youth. There was a Telpochcali in every neighborhood of the city, and from the age of about 15, attendance was compulsory. Life in the Telpochcali was harsh, disciplined, and intensely practical. The curriculum was not one of quiet academic study, but of hands-on learning and grueling physical training. The boys would spend their days learning the essential arts of warfare. They would be taught how to fight with the maquahuitl and the spear, how to use a shield, and how to move as a unit in battle formations. Their training was brutal, designed to build endurance and to strip away all fear of combat. But their education was not just military. They were taught the history of their people, not from books, but through the recitation of epic poems and songs that detailed the long migration from Aztlan and the great deeds of their ancestors. They also learned a trade, and they provided the labor for the community's public works projects, such as maintaining the canals and temples. Girls also attended the Telpochcali, though their education was separate. They were taught the religious songs, dances, and rituals that were central to every ceremony. But they were also taught a wide range of practical and economically important skills: how to spin and weave cloth, how to cook, and how to manage a household and a market stall. An Aztec woman was expected to be a productive partner in the family's economic life, and her education reflected this. The goal of the Telpochcali was to produce the ideal Aztec citizen, a brave warrior and a hard-working farmer from the boys, and a skilled, devout, and economically productive woman from the girls. But for the children of the nobility, and for the rare, exceptionally gifted commoner child who was chosen for a higher path, there was a different school. This was the Kalmekak, the House of Tears. The name itself hints at its nature. It was a place of extreme austerity, discipline, and intellectual rigor, run by the high priests. If the Telpochcali was designed to create the strong body of the empire, the Kalmekak was designed to create its wise and disciplined mind. Here, the curriculum was abstract and profound. Students would learn the complex workings of the two Aztec calendars, the 365-day solar calendar and the 260-day sacred calendar. They studied astronomy, mathematics, and architecture. They learned to read and write the complex, pictographic script of their people, a skill reserved for this elite class. They studied law, government, and military strategy to prepare them to be the future generals, judges, and leaders of the empire. They memorized religious texts, learned the correct performance of every sacred ritual, and studied philosophy and poetry. Life in the Kalmakak was a life of sacrifice. The students slept on hard stone floors and ate sparingly. They would engage in frequent fasting and acts of ritual bloodletting, piercing their own tongues and ears with cactus spines as offerings to the gods. This harsh lifestyle was designed to strip away all personal weakness and to create a class of leaders who were stoic, disciplined, and in perfect communion with the divine will. It was from the Kalmakak that the empire would draw its high priests, its ambassadors, its architects, and its highest-ranking government officials. This two-track system was the engine of Aztec society. It was a sophisticated and powerful institution designed for a single purpose: social cohesion. It ensured that every single person, from the son of the emperor to the daughter of a humble farmer, knew the stories of their people, knew the songs of their gods, and understood their specific duty to the state. It was a system that valued both the practical skills needed to feed and defend the empire, and the intellectual and spiritual knowledge needed to lead it. It was a testament to the Aztec belief that the strength of the empire lay not just in its armies, but in the disciplined and educated mind of every one of its citizens. Chapter 6. The Obsidian Sword. In the Aztec world, all roads led to war. It was the engine of their economy, the primary vehicle for social advancement, and the most sacred of all religious duties. The education a commoner received, the stories they were told, and the gods they worshipped all pointed in one direction: to the battlefield. For the Aztecs, warfare was not a regrettable necessity of politics. It was the very purpose of their existence. It was a sacred duty, a cosmic hunt to acquire the most precious substance in the universe, human life, which was needed to nourish their gods and keep the sun rising each day. This philosophy shaped a unique and formidable military culture. Aztec society was a warrior society. While a man might be a farmer or a craftsman by trade, his true worth, his chance to rise above the station of his birth, was determined by his valor in combat. A young man's life truly began with his first battle. His ultimate goal was not to kill, but to capture. To slay an enemy on the battlefield was a clumsy, almost wasteful act. To capture him alive, to drag him back to Tenochtitlan to be sacrificed at the Templo Mayor, was the highest honor a warrior could achieve. A man's social rank was a direct reflection of his military success. A warrior who had taken one captive earned the right to wear his hair in a special top knot. A warrior who had taken 2 or 3 could wear specific decorated warrior suits. and a man who had captured 4 enemies alive was eligible to ascend to the highest ranks of the Aztec military, to join one of the elite and terrifying warrior societies. It was a brutal but clear meritocracy, where glory and honor were won not through birth, but through bravery and the taking of captives. To perform this sacred and violent duty, the Aztec warrior was equipped with a unique and terrifying arsenal, forged not from iron, but from wood, stone, and the very glass of a volcano. The most iconic and feared of all their weapons was the maquahuitl. It was not a sword in the European sense. It was a heavy, flat club, like a paddle or a cricket bat, carved from a single piece of strong oak wood. Grooves were cut along its 2 edges, and into these grooves, razor-sharp blades of obsidian were embedded and cemented in place with a powerful resin. Obsidian, a volcanic glass, can be flaked to a cutting edge that is many times sharper than a modern surgical scalpel. The result was a weapon of incredible and horrifying power. It was not designed for thrusting like a rapier, but for slashing with immense force. The Spanish conquistadors, who would later face this weapon, wrote of it with a mixture of terror and awe. They claimed that a single powerful blow from a maquahuitl could decapitate a horse. It was a weapon designed to inflict massive, incapacitating wounds, to sever limbs, and to slash through flesh and muscle, making it easier to subdue and capture an enemy rather than kill them outright. For longer reach, the Aztec warrior used a spear called the tepostopili, which was essentially a long wooden pole tipped with the same kind of razor-sharp obsidian blades as the maquahuitl. But their most effective ranged weapon was not the bow and arrow, but a far more ancient and powerful device, the atlatl, or spear thrower. The atlatl was a simple but ingenious tool, a piece of wood with a handle at one end and a small hook at the other. The warrior would rest the end of a light spear or dart against the hook. By swinging the atlatl over their shoulder, they used it as a lever to extend the length of their arm, allowing them to hurl the dart with a velocity and force that was far greater than they could achieve by hand alone. In the hands of a skilled warrior, the atlatl was a deadly and accurate weapon, capable of piercing through the armor of their enemies from a great distance. To defend themselves, the Aztec warrior relied not on metal plate, but on a unique and surprisingly effective form of armor called the ichkahuipili. This was a thick, sleeveless vest made of densely packed and quilted cotton, which had been soaked in saltwater brine to stiffen it. It was hot and heavy, but it was remarkably effective at stopping the obsidian-tipped arrows and atlatl darts of their enemies, and it could even absorb the shock from a Spanish steel sword. Their defense was completed by a wooden shield, the chimali, which was often decorated with magnificent and symbolic featherwork, a beautiful piece of art designed for a brutal purpose. Their counterparts were the jaguar warriors, the ocelotl. They were the warriors of the night and the earth. They went into battle wearing the actual treated pelts of jaguars, with their own head fitting into the jaguar's head like a terrifying helmet. They were masters of ambush and close-quarters combat. To see the eagles and the jaguars charging across a battlefield, a blur of feathers and fur, their animal forms giving them a supernatural aura, would have been an awe-inspiring and terrifying sight. But not all of Aztec warfare was for conquest. They practiced a form of ritualized combat so strange it has no parallel in history. This was the Xochiaoyotl, the Flower War. These were pre-arranged battles between the Aztec Triple Alliance and their unconquered enemies, like the powerful city-state of Tlaxcala. An appointment would be made, and the two armies would meet on a designated sacred field. The purpose of a flower war was not to gain territory or to kill the enemy. It was a sacred ceremony, a religious spectacle, where the goal was to engage in combat and capture high-ranking warriors alive for later sacrifice. The battle often took the form of a series of one-on-one duels between the elite eagle and jaguar warriors. It was a chance for a warrior to display his courage and skill, to win glory, and to fulfill his sacred duty of providing a worthy captive for the gods. It was a bizarre and chilling fusion of a deadly sport and a religious obligation. And so, the Aztec art of war was a complete and coherent system where society, religion, and the military were inextricably linked. The battlefield was a sacred temple, and the warrior was a priest. His holy duty was not merely to defeat his enemies, but to hunt and capture them, to harvest the most sacred crop of all, the human heart, the divine food that would nourish the sun and ensure that the universe would survive for one more day. Chapter 7. The Drink of the Gods. When we think of chocolate today, we imagine a sweet, solid bar, a comforting treat enjoyed by all. But to travel back in time to the Aztec Empire is to discover a version of chocolate that is almost unrecognizably different. It was not a sweet candy, but a bitter, frothy, and often spicy drink. It was not a common pleasure, but a sacred and exclusive luxury, a symbol of power, and a currency more valuable than gold. This is the story of Xocolatl, the bitter water, the food of the gods. The journey begins with the cacao tree, a plant that thrives in the warm, humid lowlands of Mesoamerica. The Aztecs believed that this precious tree was not of this world. According to their myths, the cacao tree was a gift from the great god Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. The story tells that Quetzalcoatl stole the tree from the paradise of the gods and brought it down to earth as a gift to humanity, to provide them with nourishment and wisdom. Because of this divine origin, the cacao bean was considered a sacred object, a direct connection to the world of the gods. This sacred status made the cacao bean incredibly valuable, so much so that it became the official currency of the Aztec Empire. The Aztecs did not use metal coins. Instead, their vast and bustling economy ran on a system of barter, with the humble cacao bean serving as a standardized unit of value for everyday transactions. Imagine walking through the great market at Tlatelolco with a small bag of cacao beans, A single large ripe tomato might cost you 1 bean. A turkey egg could be purchased for 3 beans. A full-grown rabbit might cost 30 beans, while a large canoe could be bought for several hundred. The conquered provinces of the empire, especially those in the warm coastal regions where cacao grew, were often required to pay their tribute to the emperor in the form of thousands, sometimes millions, of cacao beans. Great storehouses in the capital of Tenochtitlan were filled not with gold, but with this precious edible currency. The system was so sophisticated that it even had its own counterfeiters, who would carefully empty the shell of a cacao bean and refill it with clay to pass it off as the real thing. To the Aztecs, money literally grew on trees. But the bean's ultimate purpose was not as money, but as the ingredient for a powerful and exclusive beverage. The preparation of xocolotl was a complex and ritualized art. First, the cacao beans were harvested, fermented, and laid out in the sun to dry. Then, they were roasted over a fire, which unlocked their deep and complex aroma. The brittle shells were removed, leaving the cacao nibs. These nibs were then painstakingly ground by hand on a heated stone slab called a metate, a process that would slowly transform the solid nibs into a thick, rich, oily paste. This pure cacao paste was the foundation of the drink, but it was rarely consumed on its own. It was far too bitter. To make it palatable, the Aztecs would mix it with a variety of potent and aromatic ingredients, but almost never with a sweetener. The most common addition was finely ground chili peppers, which gave the drink a surprising and pleasant heat. They would also add vanilla, another native plant of Mesoamerica, as well as fragrant flowers like magnolia, and sometimes a pinch of annatto, which gave the drink a rich reddish color, reminiscent of blood. Often, finely ground maize would be added to give the drink a thicker, more nourishing consistency, like a thin porridge. The final step was to create the most highly prized part of the drink, the froth. The mixture of cacao paste and water was poured from a great height, from one vessel into another, over and over again. This process, requiring great skill, would agitate the liquid and create a thick, rich, and stable foam on the surface. The froth was considered the most delicious part of the drink. The resulting beverage was a potent, stimulating, and intensely flavored concoction, served cool in ornate decorated goblets. It was bitter, sometimes spicy, and had a powerful effect on the body, a result of the theobromine and caffeine naturally present in the cacao. This was not a comforting bedtime drink. It was a drink of power. Because of its value as currency and its sacred origins, the consumption of xocolotl was a privilege strictly reserved for the highest echelons of Aztec society. It was the drink of the nobles, the high priests, and the elite warriors. The common people could rarely, if ever, afford to taste it. In the grand palace of the Emperor Moctezuma II, it was said that he drank dozens of golden goblets of the beverage every day, and that his personal storehouses contained a hoard of over 1 billion cacao beans. For the Aztec warrior, chocolate was a source of sacred energy. The drink was given to soldiers before they marched into battle, its stimulating properties giving them strength and endurance. It was also consumed in a ceremonial context, during the solemn rituals that punctuated the religious calendar, and at the great feasts that celebrated royal weddings and military victories. And so, the true history of chocolate is not one of a sweet, simple pleasure. It is a story of a divine gift that became the money of an empire. It is the story of a bitter, powerful drink, reserved for the gods and the kings who served them. It is a reminder that the foods we enjoy today often have deep, complex, and surprising histories. The next time you taste the sweetness of modern chocolate, you might remember its ancient and more formidable past. A bitter water, a sacred bean, that was once the beating heart of the Aztec world. Chapter 8. A universe painted in blood. At the heart of the Aztec Empire, at the center of their magnificent city, rose the great twin pyramids of the Templo Mayor. It was the axis of their universe, a man-made mountain connecting the earth to the heavens. But it was also an altar, a stage for a constant and brutal ritual that has defined the Aztecs in the popular imagination ever since. The act of human sacrifice. To our modern minds, it is an act of almost unimaginable cruelty, a practice that seems to negate the beauty and sophistication of the civilization that created it. But to understand the Aztecs, we cannot turn away. We must try to understand the why. We must look at the universe through their eyes. A universe that they believed was incredibly fragile and always on the very brink of a violent, apocalyptic end. Their philosophy was rooted in their most sacred creation myth, the legend of the 5 suns. The Aztecs did not believe their world was the first, or that it was permanent. They believed the gods had tried and failed 4 times before to create a stable universe. Each of these previous worlds, or suns, had its own generation of humanity and its own ruling god, and each was destroyed in a great cataclysm. The first sun, the jaguar sun, was ruled by the god Tezcatlipoca. After 676 years, the world was consumed by ferocious jaguars. The second sun, the wind sun, was ruled by Quetzalcoatl. It was destroyed by a great magical hurricane that swept away everything in its path. The third sun, the rain sun, was ruled by the rain god Tlaloc, and it was destroyed by a rain of fire. The fourth sun, the water sun, was ruled by the water goddess Chalchiuhtlicue, and it was annihilated by a great flood that lasted for 52 years. After the destruction of the fourth sun, the universe was dark and empty. The gods gathered in the darkness at the ancient holy site of Teotihuacan to decide how to create a new fifth sun. They built a great sacrificial pyre. A volunteer was needed, a god brave enough to sacrifice himself by leaping into the divine fire to be reborn as the new sun. The proud and wealthy god, Tenochtitlan, volunteered. But at the last moment, as he felt the intense heat of the flames, he hesitated in fear. It was then that a humble, sickly, and pockmarked god named Tenochtitlan, who had been sitting quietly to the side, showed true courage. With no hesitation, he closed his eyes and cast himself into the heart of the fire. He was consumed, and then he was reborn, rising into the dark sky as the brilliant, powerful sun. Shamed by Tenochtitlan's bravery, Tenochtitlan finally leaped into the fading embers of the fire. He too was reborn, but his light was less brilliant. He became the moon. But a terrible problem arose. The new sun, the fifth sun, hung motionless in the sky. It would not move. It demanded nourishment, a sacrifice to give it the energy to begin its journey across the heavens. And so, the other gods performed a final, ultimate act of self-sacrifice. One by one, they offered their own hearts and their own precious blood to the sun. Fed by this divine offering, the sun began to move, and the world as we know it, the age of the fifth sun, was set in motion. This story was the absolute foundation of the Aztec worldview. It taught them a chilling lesson. The universe was not a gift. It had been purchased at a great price. The willing self-sacrifice of the gods themselves. This act created a profound and eternal debt. If the gods had to shed their own blood to create the world, then it was humanity's sacred and inescapable duty to repay that debt, to keep the sun moving, and to prevent the violent end of their age. The Aztecs believed they were the people of the sun, and their primary purpose was to provide the gods with the only nourishment that could sustain them. Chalchihuatl, the precious water, the life force contained in human blood and hearts. This cosmic duty was directed primarily toward a trinity of powerful gods. The most important was their own patron, the sun and war god, Huitzilopochtli. He was the sun at its midday peak, the relentless warrior. The Aztecs believed that every night he had to journey through the underworld and do battle with the forces of darkness. His sister, the moon goddess, and his brothers, the stars. He required a constant supply of blood to have the strength for this nightly battle. If he were to weaken, the darkness would triumph, and the sun would not rise. Then there was Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror. He was a powerful and unpredictable god of the night, of fate, and of sorcery. He was a trickster, a bringer of both good fortune and sudden disaster. Human sacrifices were made to appease his chaotic and often malevolent nature, in the hopes of staving off random misfortune. And finally, there was Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, the god of wind, wisdom, and life. Quetzalcoatl was a creator god who, in most myths, was opposed to human sacrifice. He preferred offerings of flowers, incense, and butterflies. This internal conflict shows that the Aztec worldview was not monolithic, but it was the demanding, bloodthirsty vision of Huitzilopochtli that dominated the state religion. The ritual of sacrifice was a frequent and highly organized public spectacle. The victims were primarily captured enemy warriors, taken in the Flower Wars or in wars of conquest. The ritual itself was a precise and solemn ceremony. The chosen victim was often treated with great honor in the days leading up to their death, sometimes dressed in the regalia of the god they were to be sacrificed to. On the day of the ceremony, they would be led up the steep, double staircase of the Templo Mayor. Great crowds would gather in the plaza below, and the air would be thick with the sound of deep, booming drums and high-pitched flutes. At the summit, before the temple of Huitzilopochtli, the victim would be held down over a convex sacrificial stone by 4 priests. A 5th priest, the high priest, would then take up a razor-sharp knife of obsidian or flint. With a single expert motion, he would make an incision below the rib cage, reach into the chest cavity, and sever the arteries, pulling out the still beating heart. He would hold the heart up to the sun, a direct offering to the god. The lifeless body would then be pushed from the temple top, tumbling down the steep steps to the plaza below. This was the most common form of sacrifice, but there were others. In gladiatorial sacrifices, a particularly brave captive warrior would be given a mock weapon and forced to fight against fully armed jaguar and eagle knights. And in times of severe drought, sacrifices were made to the rain god, Tlaloc. These often involved the ritual killing of children, whose tears were believed to be a plea to the heavens that would bring the rain. To us, this is a world of unrelenting horror. But to the Aztecs, it was a world of profound and precarious balance. Their universe was fragile, constantly poised on the edge of annihilation. Human sacrifice was not, in their minds, an act of cruelty, but a desperate and necessary act of cosmic maintenance. It was the terrible price they believed they had to pay to be the collaborators of the gods, the gardeners of the cosmos, whose sacred duty was to ensure that the sun would rise again tomorrow. Chapter 8. The Serpent Arrives. In the year 1519, the Aztec Empire was at the absolute zenith of its power. From his magnificent palace in the heart of the great city, Tenochtitlan, the Emperor Moctezuma II reigned as the most powerful man in the Americas. He was not a simple king, but the Huitlatoni, the great speaker, a semi-divine figure who was the high priest of his people and the commander of an unstoppable army. His empire was vast, his treasuries were full, and his authority was absolute. And yet, his spirit was troubled. For nearly a decade, strange and terrible omens had been appearing across the land, signs that the sages and priests could not fully interpret, but which spoke of a coming upheaval. A comet, like a fiery ear of corn, had blazed across the daytime sky. The temple of the war god Huitzilopochtli had spontaneously burst into flames. The waters of the Great Lake had boiled and flooded the city for no reason. And at night, the mournful cry of a wailing woman was heard, weeping for the fate of her children. The universe, it seemed, was holding its breath, waiting for a great and terrible change. Then, the messages began to arrive. From the eastern coast, messengers ran day and night to bring the emperor news. Strange objects, like floating mountains with great white wings, had appeared on the surface of the sea. From these floating mountains came a new kind of people. They were pale, with hair on their faces, and their bodies were covered in a strange, shining stone. They rode upon giant, hornless deer, and they wielded sticks that could create thunder and lightning. For Moctezuma, a deeply religious man, this news was not just a military intelligence report. It was a profound religious crisis. For his entire life, he had been steeped in the legends of his people, and one of the most important was the story of the god Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. The legend told that this pale, bearded god of wisdom and creation had long ago departed from their lands, sailing eastward across the sea. But he had promised to one day return, and the prophesied year of his return was one reed. The year 1519, the very year these strangers arrived, was one reed in the Aztec calendar. Moctezuma was now faced with an impossible dilemma. Were these strange arrivals merely mortal men? Or were they the divine Quetzalcoatl and his entourage, returning as promised to reclaim his kingdom? To act with aggression against a god would be suicide. To welcome a foreign invader would be treason. He chose a cautious middle path, one of diplomacy and divine inquiry. He dispatched emissaries to the coast, bearing with them the most sacred and magnificent gifts from his treasury. These were not random treasures, but the 4 distinct ceremonial costumes of the god Quetzalcoatl himself. A mask made of a mosaic of brilliant turquoise, a cloak of iridescent quetzal feathers, and shields of gold and mother of pearl. It was a test. If the leader of these strangers was indeed the returning god, he would recognize his sacred regalia. The leader of the strangers was not a god. He was a Spanish nobleman named Hernán Cortés, a man of immense ambition, cunning, and ruthless determination. When he received the magnificent gifts, he saw not the sacred symbols of a returning god, but the undeniable proof of a land of immense wealth, a land ripe for conquest. He accepted the gifts, and then, in defiance of Moctezuma's polite but firm requests that he go no further, Cortés made a fateful decision. He burned his own ships, a dramatic act to ensure there was no retreat for his men, and he began to march inland. His force was absurdly small, a few hundred soldiers, 16 horses, and a handful of cannons. But Cortés wielded a weapon far more powerful than any of these, his political cunning. He quickly understood that the Aztec Empire was not a unified, monolithic kingdom. It was a fragile alliance of conquered city-states, most of whom despised their Aztec overlords and the heavy tribute of goods and sacrificial victims they were forced to pay. Cortés marched to the city-state of Tlaxcala, the Aztecs' fiercest and most hated enemy. After a series of brutal battles, the Tlaxcalans, respecting the Spaniards' strength and seeing an opportunity to destroy their ancient enemy, made an alliance with Cortés. Suddenly, his small band of conquistadors had been transformed into a great army, swelled by thousands of the most formidable native warriors in Mexico. With his new allies, Cortés marched over the high mountain passes and finally looked down upon the Valley of Mexico. The sight that met his eyes left him and his men breathless. There, in the middle of a vast, shimmering lake, lay the city of Tenochtitlan, a gleaming metropolis of white temples and palaces connected to the shore by 3 great causeways. It seemed like a vision from a dream, a city more beautiful and grander than any they had ever seen in Europe. Moctezuma now had to make another fateful choice. He could attack the approaching army on the causeways, or he could welcome them into his city. Still uncertain of their true nature, and perhaps hoping to control them better by keeping them close, he chose to welcome them. On November 8th, 1519, the 2 leaders met on the Great Causeway. The Emperor Moctezuma, the most powerful ruler in the New World, was carried in a magnificent litter, adorned with jade and a great canopy of green feathers. Cortez, the ambitious adventurer, dismounted from his horse. It was the meeting of 2 worlds, 2 empires, 2 fates. The Spanish were housed in a grand palace in the city. For a time, there was a tense and uneasy peace. The conquistadors wandered the city in a state of awe and terror, marveling at the splendor of the markets and the chinampas, but horrified by the blood-stained temples and the racks of human skulls. They were honored guests, but they were also trapped on an island, surrounded by a city of hundreds of thousands of potentially hostile warriors. Sensing his precarious position, Cortez made another audacious move. He marched to Moctezuma's palace, and under the pretext of a minor skirmish on the coast, he took the emperor himself hostage. He brought Moctezuma to the palace where the Spanish were staying and held him there, turning the divine ruler of the empire into a puppet, through whom Cortez could now issue commands. This fragile and bizarre state of affairs was shattered when Cortez was forced to leave the city to confront a rival Spanish force on the coast. He left his most volatile and hot-headed captain, Pedro de Alvarado, in command. During a great religious festival, the Feast of Tenochtitlan, Alvarado, either from greed or from a paranoid fear of an imminent uprising, made a terrible decision. As the Aztec nobility, unarmed and dressed in their finest ceremonial costumes, danced in the sacred precinct, Alvarado ordered his men to seal the exits and attack. It was a brutal, unprovoked massacre. The city, which had so far tolerated the strange guests, exploded in a unified, uncontrollable rage. When Cortez returned, he found the city in a state of total war. The bridges on the causeways were razed, and the Spanish were besieged in their palace. In the chaos, Moctezuma was killed. The Spanish claimed he was killed by a stone thrown by his own people as he tried to pacify them. The Aztecs claimed the Spanish murdered him. With their puppet king gone and the city baying for their blood, Cortez knew their only option was to escape. On a dark and rainy night, which the Spanish would forever remember as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, they attempted to flee the city across one of the causeways, but they were discovered. Aztec warriors in thousands of canoes swarmed the causeways. The battle was a chaotic, desperate slaughter. The Spanish soldiers, weighed down by the stolen gold and treasure they had stuffed into their armor, were cut down or pushed into the lake, where they drowned. Cortez and a fraction of his men managed to fight their way to the mainland. It is said that he sat beneath a great tree and wept, mourning the loss of his men and the complete and humiliating defeat. He had been driven from the city, his army was in ruins, and the Aztec Empire had, it seemed, triumphed. But the Spanish had left behind a silent and invisible ally, a weapon far more devastating than any cannon or steel blade. Smallpox had been introduced into the city, and as the Aztecs celebrated their victory, the Great Dying was just beginning. Chapter 9. The fall in the aftermath of the Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, a great celebration swept through Tenochtitlan. The strange pale invaders had been routed, their power broken, their greed punished. The gods, it seemed, had been appeased. The priests of Huitzilopochtli worked tirelessly, offering the hearts of the captured Spaniards to the sun god in thanks for their victory. The new emperor, Cuitlahuac, a valiant and respected warrior, began to restore order to the capital and prepare its defenses for any future attack. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the nightmare was over. But the true enemy was not the one they had fought on the causeways. It was an invisible conqueror, now moving silently through the city's crowded streets and markets. The Spanish had left behind the smallpox virus. For the peoples of the Americas, this was an alien monster. They had no ancestral immunity, no defenses against it. It was a virgin soil epidemic, and its effect was not just a plague, it was an apocalypse. The disease swept through Tenochtitlan with a speed and fury that was unimaginable. The accounts describe a horror that defies words. A high fever, followed by the eruption of the agonizing, blistering pustules. The victims were in too much pain to move, to even shift their position in bed. So many were afflicted at once that there was no one left to care for the sick or to prepare food. People began to starve to death in their own homes, their cries for water going unanswered. The disease killed a third, perhaps even half, of the entire population of the city in a matter of months. Among its victims was the heroic Emperor Cuitlahuac himself, who had reigned for only 80 days. The sickness did not just kill the people, it killed the leadership, the morale, and the spirit of the Aztec world. It was a blow from which they would never recover. While Tenochtitlan was being hollowed out by this invisible enemy, Hernán Cortés was not idle. He had retreated to the safety of the allied city-state of Tlaxcala, and he was meticulously planning his revenge. He was a master of strategy, and he now understood the key to conquering the island city. He needed to control the water. To do this, he ordered his men to undertake one of the most audacious feats of military engineering in history. He had his shipwrights begin the construction of a fleet of 13 small, shallow draft warships called brigantines. These were not built on the coast, but in the mountains of Tlaxcala. When they were complete, they were taken apart, piece by piece. Every plank, every sail, every piece of rigging was then carried by thousands of his Tlaxcalan allies over the 50-mile stretch of high mountain passes to the shores of Lake Texcoco. There, on the edge of the enemy's lake, the Spanish reassembled their fleet. Each ship was armed with a cannon. Cortés now had a navy, a weapon the Aztecs could not counter. In the spring of 1521, as the new and final Aztec emperor, the young and fierce Cuauhtémoc, the descending eagle, prepared for the coming assault, Cortés returned. His army was now immense, swelled by over 75,000 allied Tlaxcalan warriors, who saw this as their chance to finally destroy their hated rivals. The great siege of Tenochtitlan began. Cortés launched a three-pronged attack, his armies advancing along the three great causeways that connected the city to the mainland. At the same time, his new fleet of brigantines launched onto the lake. They were unstoppable. Their cannons shattered the Aztec war canoes, and within days, the Spanish had complete control of the water. Tenochtitlan was now completely cut off, an island prison. The aqueducts that brought fresh water into the city were cut. No food could get in. The fighting was brutal and relentless. For 80 long days, the city held out. The battle for the causeways was a grinding, bloody stalemate. The Spanish and their allies would advance during the day, capturing sections of the road, only to be pushed back at night by ferocious Aztec counterattacks from canoes. The air was filled with the constant, terrifying sound of the great serpent-skin drum booming from the top of the Templo Mayor, a sound that struck fear into the hearts of the conquistadors. From their positions, they were forced to watch in horror as their captured comrades were led up the steps of the Great Pyramid, their hearts torn out and offered to Huitzilopochtli. Frustrated by the back-and-forth fighting, Cortés adopted a new and terrible tactic. He ordered his men to destroy the city as they advanced. Every house, every temple, every building they captured was to be systematically demolished, and its rubble used to fill in the canals. They were not just conquering the city. They were unmaking it, stone by stone. The beautiful Venice of the New World was being slowly and deliberately leveled, its water streets filled with the bones of its own architecture. Inside the besieged city, the conditions became a living hell. The people were starving. They were reduced to eating the bark from trees, lizards, and worms. The lack of fresh water meant they could only drink the bracky, contaminated water of the lake, which caused a new wave of sickness to sweep through the starving population. Yet, under the command of their warrior king, Cuauhtémoc, they refused to surrender. They fought for every street, for every rooftop, for every inch of their dying city. The fighting continued for months, until the once great city had been reduced to a small, smoldering ruin in the district of Tlatelolco. Finally, on August 13, 1521, it was over. The last of the starving, exhausted Aztec warriors were defeated. The Emperor Cuauhtémoc, attempting to escape by canoe, was captured by a Spanish brigantine. He was brought before Hernán Cortés, and in a final act of dignity, he is said to have touched Cortés's dagger and asked the conqueror to kill him. The siege was over. The Aztec Empire had fallen. The survivors who crawled out from the ruins of the city were a ghostly sight. The Spanish soldiers were horrified by the devastation. The canals were choked with the dead, the ground littered with bodies. The great city, the city that had so amazed them with its beauty and its order, was gone. A Nahuatl poet, an anonymous survivor, later wrote of the fall, "Broken spears lie in the roads. We have torn our hair in our grief. The houses are roofless now, and their walls are red with blood. We have gnawed on the adobe walls. We have eaten lizards and worms. Smoke and dust have lifted and spread over us. We have pounded our hands in despair against the adobe walls, for our inheritance, our city, is lost and dead." The fall of the Aztec Empire was not a simple story of European military superiority. It was a complex catastrophe, born of a perfect storm, a clash of two worlds, the political genius and ruthlessness of Cortés, the deep fractures within the Aztecs' own tribute empire, and above all, the silent, invisible devastation of a disease against which the Aztecs had no defense. The story of the Mexica, which had begun with the divine prophecy of an eagle on a cactus, had ended in a storm of steel, fire, and pestilence. Their great city was destroyed, their gods were overthrown, and their world was erased, leaving behind only a powerful, tragic, and enduring echo in the memory of history.